for the invite. There we go. So thank you again for the invite from AbSPORU to participate in this journal club. We're really excited about sharing our work. And as the executive director for the Imagine Network, it really gives me great pleasure to share this platform with our co-leads for patient engagement. As Aida has mentioned, both Sandra and Deborah have been intimately involved in this research, and we have relied on them heavily to really move forward our patient engagement agenda within the network. And so I think this is a great opportunity to share some of the work that Imagine SPOR has supported in its, certainly this particular project was in its first phase of funding. As Sadia mentioned, I'm the executive director. I'm actually based in Toronto, but our network is pan-Canadian, so we do have sites across the country, and our main leads are Dr. Deborah Marshall out of University of Calgary and Dr. Paul Moyetti out of McMaster University. Sandra, maybe just next slide. And obviously, there's no conflicts of interest that we need to disclose for this particular research. The funding for this project was directly from the Imagine SPOR network, and there were a number of participants involved in spearheading this particular project. Obviously, as I mentioned, Dr. Deborah Marshall.
Just give her a minute to unfreeze.
To organize this work and move forward. So
Whoops.
they're all listed here.
You'll have to start over a little bit, Ida. You froze.
Oh, sorry about that. I didn't notice it here on my end. Where did we stop off?
Talked about we have no disclosures, and then we sort of
Okay,
lost.
so no disclosures. Thank you. Yeah, in relation to this particular project, this project was funded by the Imagine Sport Network.
Uh-oh.
This particular project forward. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you froze again just at when you were talking about the
You know what?
funding.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm just going to move my Wi-Fi over to my phone here for just 1 sec to make sure it doesn't happen again here.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll just
Yeah.
and just Ida was just touching on our study team here. So this is the whole team that was a part of the study. I'll go to the next slide. Is that okay, Ida? And then you can talk
That's
about
it. That's perfect. Thanks, Sandra. I
it.
hope it doesn't freeze up anymore. Not that I have much more to say, thank goodness. We'll move on to Sandra and Deborah very soon, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the Imagine Network is. We're obviously one of the SPOR chronic disease networks that was funded by CIHR. Our particular mandate is really understanding the interactions between brain and gut. So trying to understand how inflammation, the microbiome, which are the gut bacteria, diet and mental health really play a role in two major GI disorders, which are inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. We do have partners from hospitals and universities across the country, and obviously bring together researchers, patients, and clinicians to support this mission, which is trying to transform the management of IBD and IBS and their mental health associated disorders. So that's really it. This particular project, I think you'll find very exciting. It really helped move forward our mandate on understanding the impact and the value of patient-engaged research. And so we'll pass it on to Sandra next to give you more background on the study itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Ida. So I know I've kind of had two introductions. So I have affiliations or work with the Imagine SPOR network as well as the AbSPORU team, but I just thought I'd also mention that I am a patient and community engagement research graduate as well, or PACER. Graduated in 2014. And my direct lived experience with Imagine is that I live with inflammatory bowel disease, or more specifically, Crohn's disease. I was diagnosed at 19 years old and have been living with it for my whole adult life. So I just thought I would add that piece as well. And now I'll jump into a little bit about the background on this study. So really the aim of this study was to add evidence on the influence and impact. Sorry, just give me a moment here. I'm just going to move some things around. Okay, I'm sorry. That patient research partners have throughout the research process, as well as the outcomes of research engagement by assessing the impact of patient engagement on research design and approaches, research outputs, and the critical outcomes of research engagement. So we'll move over to the methods section. So in order to address these research gaps, we used a convergent mixed methods design, which really just means that we had two different things happening, quantitative and qualitative research, and they happen at the same time. They work together alongside each other. So we use surveys and observation to explore the impact that each research team member had on the study design, approaches, and key research outputs. And we also identified the critical outcomes of research engagement in the context of qualitative project. We established 2 project groups comprising of patient research partners with experience in training and patient engagement in health research, including some PACER-trained individuals and clinicians and researchers. So one of the groups was led by a patient research partner, and the other group was led by an academic researcher. Our rationale for studying 2 groups was to assess patient engagement in 2 similar but distinctly different groups where patient research partners would have sufficient opportunities to contribute and take part in the governance and decision-making across the cycle of the group work. Our intention was not to judge the leads or the group specifically, but to look more broadly at how patient research partners engage in and impact the group research. So we administered a screening survey right at the beginning that helped us to allocate group members to either the patient research partner-led group or the academic researcher-led group. And so this was all based on their years of experience in patient-oriented research and qualitative research, as well as by demographics, so gender and age, to ensure that both groups were matched as best as possible. Okay, so both project groups were asked to conduct a qualitative patient preferences research project independent of each other within a period of 7 months. So it was a big ask. 7 months is a short time period, relatively. And the research question that was guiding this work was, what factors are important to patients with IBD in considering treatment tapering of biologics? So just to note, because it might come up a couple of times in this presentation, biologics are a medication that are used to treat inflammatory bowel disease as well as other autoimmune diseases that ultimately help to block inflammation in the body and some more specifically in the gut. So back to the study approach, we used an example of a formative qualitative study to inform a preferences study in the context of inflammatory bowel disease, because we wanted to understand engagement of patient research partners in qualitative research to design preferences studies, which is considered and recommended as good research practice. There is little evidence about patient preferences for treatment decisions when considering biologic tapering, as well as this practice of biologic tapering hasn't really been done broadly in the community. And then there is limited evidence about how the involvement of patient research partners influences the study design, approaches, and the generation of candidate attributes. So for data collection, we collected patient engagement data from all group members in both groups. We administered surveys containing validated patient engagement self-reports that measure outcomes of patient partner engagement in all phases of the research. We complemented the survey data collection with observation of patient engagement in the 2 groups. We observed the patient engagement in the two groups for 7 months, so the whole time. The surveys contained 3 tools. So the first one was the Public and Patient Engagement Evaluation Tool, which is also known as PPEAT. Then we also used the Patient Engagement and Research Scale, which is known as PEERS, and the Ways of Engagement Activity Tool, which is known as WeEnact. No single tool had a set of measures for assessing the impact of patient engagement by all stakeholders across multiple time points, so we used a coherent set of measures. The PP was developed in a non-health research context to capture the participants' assessments of the key features of an engagement initiative, whereas PEERS was developed to capture meaningful engagement of patient partners. And WeEnact was developed for a direct inquiry of patient engagement, specifically within the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which is also known as PCORI, funded research teams. So this is a snapshot of when we administered the tools. So at the very beginning, as I sort of mentioned earlier, so prior to starting, we used the WeEnact, which was a screening survey to help us to split the groups up, basically. Then at the 2nd month timeframe, we again administered the WeEnact, and then we administered all 3 surveys post-engagement. So the WeEnact, the PPEAT, and the PEERS at the end of the project. Additionally, there was observation that happened. So these groups were made up of people that came from various locations across Canada, as well as this study was conducted during COVID. So everything was done online or virtually via Zoom. Observation was done in an open and transparent manner as the observers attended all the online meetings. Group members were informed in the consent, and at the first group meeting, they were being observed and all data would be anonymized prior to the analysis. After the first meeting where staff introduced themselves, they faded into the background so members could act naturally while discussing the project with the hope that these strategies would help to put the research team members at ease and not alter their behavior. We assigned 2 study staff, 1 for each group to observe, documenting all exchanges of online meetings and emails among group members. For example, the staff documented what changes patient research partners proposed that were made or not made, and why and how the groups appropriately integrated group member suggestions. These notes were discussed during study team meetings to guide further data collection and generation. The staff received training in 4 questions of observation. So what to observe, how to preserve what is observed, and how to tell what is observed. The staff kept notes using a semi-structured guide and noted down the interactions and behaviors between group members. So this would be referred to as descriptive data. And this is a little bit important because the next slide we talk a little bit about this. So they also recorded their thoughts, biases, questions, initial interpretations of the discussions, potential themes, and direct quotes that seem significant. So this is what we call reflective data. All meetings were recorded to validate the notes kept by the staff. So for the analysis, we collected and analyzed quantitative and qualitative data separately first. We used descriptive statistics for our closed survey questions and thematic analysis for open-ended survey questions. We also analyzed our qualitative data thematically using a framework called Critical Outcomes of Research Engagement, which is also known as CORE, to identify the overall critical outcomes of patient research partner engagement in research. We also created journey maps for patient research partners, clinicians, and researchers to see how they influence the project at each project stage and activity. And this is just a snapshot of the data analysis and integration. So once all the qualitative and quantitative data was analyzed separately, so if we go to the table on the right-hand side of the screen and go to the first bucket on the left called survey data, you'll see that all the 3 evaluation tools are in there, and then it splits. So one side is the closed questions, which is the quantitative data, where we use statistical analysis, and that became data set number 1. Then it's split to the other side where there's open-ended questions, which is qualitative data, which we use thematic analysis, and that became data set number 2. So now just going over to the right, to the top bucket called observation, where those two split. So we have the descriptive and the reflective, which were both qualitative data that were thematically analyzed, and that became data set number 3. Once we had all of those 3 data sets analyzed, they became integrated into one data set, which became data set number 4. So we addressed any discordance in our findings during a member check-in exercise with both groups after the discussions, and the analysis was conducted by 2 study team members. A third team member checked the coding and analysis of the observation data just for further validation. So that sort of closes off my section, and I'm going to pass it over to Deborah to share the results of this study.
All righty. Thank you so much. And great setup, Sandra. As you can appreciate, those engaging in this session, this is a complicated study design. And Sandra and Aida will share with me that with our study, or what I think we called them the overarching study research team, it took us quite a while to land on this design, which admittedly isn't a standard bread and butter, study, because it combines a lot of different methods and a lot of different tools. But actually, that's why I think we really had a huge opportunity because of the richness of the data that was collected, which was quite massive, actually, because of these different methods. So if you think about it, we have 3 survey tools. We had the observation method, which was really labor intensive for our research team. And then it was combining, like Sandra so nicely went through that flow diagram, all of these data sets together. So it was a massive undertaking, but it was pretty cool too, in the sense that we had the opportunity to really do a lot. And I realize I can't move the slides. Is it Sandra, please?
Yeah, and it might be worth also mentioning that we had an executive committee that met regularly to, first of all, plan and design this, which took us a lot of meetings.
It
It was
did.
tricky. Yes.
It was indeed. And so one of the neat things too is we did use this framework. I don't know how many of you are familiar, and happy to discuss this. In the end, you always have to choose something, right? But this kind of worked really well because this speaks to what they call the 11 core outcomes and measures around patient engagement. And so I like this little diagram because it's showing we're trying to measure the impact of patient engagement on the conduct, so the process of doing the research, as well as the outcomes. And then with these 11 different core measures, you can think about the short-term and the long-term outcomes of the collaboration. So it gives a lot of depth, again, to the data analysis. Next slide. I won't go through them all. We can talk about that. But what I want to do now is the way in which we structured the results is that we analyzed the launch stage. So we broke the research up into stages. So there's the launch stage, the design stage, the implementation stage, and the knowledge translation stage. So I'm just going to tippy-toe through each of these. We want to have lots of discussion time, but just to kind of refresh you or kind of frame this for our discussion. In the launch stage, there's sort of 4 big bullets here, and you'll see those in the tables in the paper. So 3A, B, C, D. We have tables, 1 for each of the stages of research. And we go through in detail about what elements we observed engagement in. So for the launch stage, we found that the people in the groups did share their experiential knowledge and needs. They shared what their research interests were, what their skills were, what their strengths and maybe their weaknesses were, and also very realistically talked about their availability to work on the project. So, and you'll note here that this was particularly in the patient-led group. So the group had good dialogue and figured out, what was really going to work. And then they also figured out, what was the whole project plan? Sandra mentioned each of the groups had an equal amount of time from start to finish. So we launched them both in parallel, and there was a deadline, and they had, resources allocated to them, and they had to work within that as well. So they worked together to finalize the project plan. Everybody had a role, etc. And this was particularly in the patient-led group. So on the right-hand side of this slide, what I've done is I've taken these 11 core outcomes from the core framework, and in the paper, you'll see that we essentially mapped each of the stages of the analysis to what we observed in terms of the core outcomes. So on the right-hand side there, you'll see patient-centered, meaningful, team collaboration, sustainable. So we were able to observe all of these elements of core in the launch stage. Next slide, please. And this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but you can see how we've approached this. So we have the launch stage, and we broke it down into the critical activities of the research. And then what did the group members do? And then how did it influence the research process and impact the outcomes? So our research team extracted basically each quotes from the discussions and really then linked those, and you'll see them in the table in the paper, but gets a little dense here, for each of the core 11 outcome measures. So that's how we analyze this. And as you can imagine, it was very iterative. There's a lot of density in the data here. Next slide. So then if we think about the design stage, again, I've highlighted here in the red box the elements of the core framework. So not only in the design stage was it patient-centered, meaningful, team collaboration, and sustainability that we observed, we also actually observed the legitimacy process, like the process of making it legitimate, understandable, rigorous. I mean, the team debated and discussed. They made sure that it had integrity for them and would adapt to the different approaches that they chose to take in designing their study. Feasible, timely, had to be. They had to figure out how to make it work within these parameters, and also ethical and transparent. So those are actually the 11 core outcome measures. And in the paper, you'll see how we break it down in the design stage. So how did they operationalize their research question? How did they choose what study design to use? Because basically we said it was qualitative research, but as you know, there's a lot of different ways to do that. They did literature reviews, so the teams engaged in the literature reviews and then reviewed the study materials to decide how to move forward in their overall design. So a big question, I just highlight this for the team, was the whole debate around what does tapering mean? And it's really interesting because it paralleled one of our projects that we're doing on tapering in inflammatory disease, because we've had big discussions with our clinicians about what do you mean by tapering? Does it mean stop? Does it mean slowing down? Does it mean doing it on a certain time frame? Does it mean reducing dose? Does it mean, like, what does it actually mean? And we know that the practice patterns are quite different. So both groups actually ended up having quite a big discussion around this, even though for us, the actual topic wasn't the focus per se of this research. It was the process and the outcomes and how they engage. So, okay, next slide. Move along here. So you'll see the analogous thing for the design stage. Again, what were the critical research activities? So it was refining this question, designing the study, choosing a way to execute, developing the study material, doing the literature search. And you'll see we pulled out in the tables, I think this is 3B, you'll see how this influenced and impacted the research. Thank you. Next slide. And then on the third is the implementation stage. How did they actually engage? Again, all of the 11 elements of core were observed in this stage where there was recruitment. So they actually had to do an ethics application, submit the application, get this done. So based on their design, and they recruited the participants, they collected the data, they were involved in the analysis, and then they were also involved in the interpretation and influenced the list of attributes that was generated from their work. Next slide, please. And you'll see in the paper, this is table 3C, you know, these are the critical research activities that they engaged in and what the group members did and how it made a difference in the whole data collection stage in this case. Next slide, please. And then in the analysis stage, how it made it. And we have quotes in the paper as well. Next slide, please. And then just to highlight the fact that we complemented this, as Sandra showed in that diagram, with the actual tools like WeEnact. That really helped us understand which research activities, because if you're familiar with it, it breaks it down in terms of all of the research activities. And we use that data as well to triangulate essentially these findings. And there's a whole separate paper on the 3 survey tools. So next slide, please. And then the last stage is that KT stage. So they discussed, you know, what the plan would be for publication and presentations, platforms, etc. So as part of their activities, they provided a KT plan. And then we observed these 5 different elements of core in that stage of the research. Next slide, please. So just to, even though this isn't the big focus, they did produce different outputs, you know, from the actual research. Yes, they identified attributes that would be used in preferences research, but they had different numbers of attributes. Some of them overlapped, some of them were unique. In general, in the patient-led group, there were more outcome attributes, and they were presented in different kind of language than in the research-led group. It was more patient-friendly kind of language, and the viewpoint of the attributes was from the patient perspective. Whereas in the research-led group, it was a little more clinical research sort of terminology. Next slide. So just in conclusion, and we're looking forward to the discussion, you know, the patient research partners perform many, or maybe all aspects of the project work in some ways and provided insights that shaped the direction of this work, all the way from, you know, designing, from planning to analysis to the outcomes. And this, I just kind of like this because it sort of shows across the different steps things that they had an influence on. So how do you interpret the research question? Was the lived experience embedded in the approach, and was it as unbiased as we could make it? Was it ethical and transparent? All of these kinds of things that came into play in the design. Next slide, please. And then we found that all elements of core did apply. So I just listed them here, but those are all the 11 boxes in the core framework. And then just as the next slide, Basically, bottom line, if I had to give you the 3-second elevator speech, there was collaborative and meaningful engagement of patients and researchers. Yes, they absolutely can influence the research design and approach and the outputs. I don't think that's any surprise to the audience on this webinar. But what we were really trying to do is analyze that. Like, we all, I think, a priori would have said that. And we all have probably the intuition that it's really good to engage patients in this project. But what we were trying to do is kind of tippy-toe and kind of dissect that a little bit and really be able to bring some structure to, well, what does that mean in the research process and also in an outcomes on a specific project. So I really hope this will stimulate you and others to do some more research to really understand this process. Obviously, it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, so we can't attribute any causality to this, but we found with some really rich data and observations in terms of the interactions and engagement of our teams. So looking forward to having a chat with you. I have some backup slides if we want to talk about other frameworks and things. So thank you.